Negroes came to the northern city to find freedom and opportunity, but they were met with violence and oppression. You see, the city was the battleground. Negroes and whites were the contenders. One trying to rise up and the other trying to keep them down. Now let's talk about it. We're continuing from the 1945 book Black Metropolis by Dr. St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton. Integrity. The Negro community in Chicago began as a haven of refuge for escaped slaves. Back in the mid-1800s, whoever escaped the Southern white game of slavery had an opportunity to reach Chicago, a place where they could find at least some type of relief. Now, at this time, the Negro presence was small enough that Northern whites didn't see it as much of an issue. It emerged a century later as Black Metropolis, inhabited by the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of slaves. Black Metropolis, a city within a city. Starting in the early 1900s, blacks rushed into Chicago in great, massive numbers. And they stacked their numbers on the roots of earlier generations until their presence itself became a metropolis. In the years between, it had become a citadel of economic and political power in the midst of Midwest metropolis, an integral part of the city political machine and a reservoir for industrial labor and personal and domestic servants. The story of the growth of Black metropolis between the Civil War and the Depression is, with minor variations, the story of the Negro in New York, Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and a number of other cities in America's northeastern and east central industrial areas. Why? Because Negroes leaving the South were mostly the same in mentality and behavior, and they found themselves in northern places with similar social and environmental pressure. What pressure? The job ceiling, slum houses, poor schools, factory floors, etc. So if you put the same kind of people in the same kind of environment, you get the same kind of result. That's why the story repeated itself city after city. During the Second World War, it became the story, too, of San Francisco and Los Angeles, as Negroes streamed to the West Coast to help man the arsenal of democracy. Same stuff. Negroes in America are becoming a city people. What does it mean, becoming a city people? It shows us that identities aren't fixed. People can become and unbecome. Negroes were unbecoming rural people and becoming city people. And it is in the cities that the problem of the Negro in American life appears in its sharpest and most dramatic forms. Why? Because the city packs everything tight. From the people, to the jobs, to the housing. So there's no running, there's no hiding, and there's no making people invisible like can be done in the vastness of the country. So Negroes in the city were squeezed together, competing for the same jobs as whites, voting on the same issues as whites, and clashing culturally with the white world around them. And that pressure made everything sharper and harder to ignore. It may be, too, that the cities will be the arena in which the Negro problem will be finally settled, meaning the Negro problem won't be pushed back into the secluded countryside. It was in their face, and it had to be dealt with on the city turf. A study of Negro life in Chicago is important, not only because it is typical of northern urban communities, but also because it involves one of the cities in which change is taking place most rapidly, and where in the next decade friction and even conflict between capital and labor, Negroes and whites, will probably reach its most intense form, and where a new pattern of race relations is most likely to evolve. Water and heat have their own form. But when enough heat is applied to water, it boils into steam. A new pattern begins to form. The clash of Negroes and whites in the city worked the same way. Conflict heated Chicago and the old order was weakening. In the South, the pattern was fixed subordination. In the North, the authors warned that the new pattern would likely be constant struggle for power. The progressive urbanization of the Negro has not been confined to cities of the North and the West, however. Even before the Civil War, Southern cities were havens of refuge for a significant segment of the Negro population, free persons of color. In Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, New Orleans, and even smaller centers like Natchez, those Negroes congregated who had been able to buy their freedom or who had been freed by their masters. Except in New Orleans, their status was precarious, and in no Southern cities were they allowed full freedom. Full freedom included rights to vote, equal standing in courts, freedom to marry across the color line, open access to the labor market, and not living under constant threat that whites would wake up one day and take it all away. And the authors say outside of New Orleans, Negroes in the Southern cities didn't have that full freedom. In the cities of the pre-Civil War North, on the other hand, free Negroes and escaped slaves were able to develop in a more favorable social environment. So before 1861, the North was a space of refuge. Many Negroes like Mr. Frederick Douglass escaped slavery to get there. It was a place where, on paper, Negroes could live without daily fear of being treated like someone's property. It was a place where they could enter trades, where they could create small businesses. It was a place where they could form their own institutions. Now, it still had prejudice, but it didn't require Negroes to walk around bowing to whites and being timid. The baseline of the pre-Civil War North was a more favorable social environment. These differences between urban North and urban South have persisted to the present day, and thus, while Negroes in the South are more free than those in the small towns and on the plantations, they are less free than Negroes in black metropolis and cities like it, which is why so many Negroes continue to leave the South to go north. They had to sacrifice comfort of familiarity in the South to journey into unknown territory in the North in hope of more dignity and freedom. These differences have been summarized by one Negro scholar, Dr. L.D. Reddick, who lists 4 basic things which distinguish the Negro's status in the North from his position in the South. The law is on his side in the fight for equal rights. He is not disfranchised. There is no tradition of slavery, a lost cause, and the crime of Reconstruction, and the general social and intellectual development of both whites and Negroes is higher. The difference between Negro and white is the basic social division in the Deep South and in most of the border states, which is what? The very existence of social order is believed to depend upon keeping the Negro in his place, meaning when the social order was created in the South, it was done so through the idea of keeping the Negro in his place. What did keeping the Negro in his place look like? A slave initially, then a cheap source of labor. There was to be no talking back. They would be shut out of many of the public spaces. They had minimal rights, if any. They were to always be below whites in character, wealth, and skill. So in practice, pretty much reduced to a living tool in order to uphold white supremacy. You see, a tool that drives nails into wood is called a hammer. The living tool they created to sit at the bottom of the social order, they named the Negro. And when you filter through all the noise and you get deep down into the rabbit hole, this is when you find this raw reality that most people are not ready for. Now let that simmer in your mind for a moment and think about what that means. The stability of the economy, the political system, the educational system, and church family and associational life are all passionately believed to require the subordination of Negroes. So it wasn't just a prejudice. It was woven into the operating system of the South. The belief that Negroes were to remain at the bottom, intensified by fervent passion, ran throughout the institutions that they built. The economy, the political system, and the churches were all in cahoots. Even when modifications are made because of economic necessity, political expediency, and democratic idealism, they must never challenge the fundamental rule of segregation in most aspects of community life. Segregation was one of the tools that kept that social order alive. It provided wealthy whites an opportunity to keep blacks in the lowest tier so they could exploit their labor, and it gave poor whites the psychological high they needed to keep them from finding common cause with the blacks. So segregation was one thing that could not be touched if white supremacy was to be sustained. And concessions must not place Negroes in competition with whites for power and prestige. It couldn't make it look or feel like Negroes were elevating any closer to whites. Power meant the control over the laws, the institutions, and the resources. Prestige meant public recognition and respect. Now, identity was a thread that weaved through both of these. To create a category called Negro, or to call someone boy, that's a raw form of domination. Understand that. For Negroes to recreate themselves by stepping outside of a name that defined them against whiteness, that would have put them in direct competition for prestige. And their system couldn't allow that. So all-embracing is this view of life, and so rigid are the controls that some scholars refer to the system of Negro-white relations in the Deep South as a caste system. Here we go. Northern institutions, on the other hand, as they evolved, did not have keeping the Negro in his place as one of their primary objectives. The South, where the vast majority of Negroes originated, built their entire system around that objective. The North always had a relatively small population of Negroes, so the pressure wasn't there to build an institution around keeping them down. In many ways, the position of Negroes in northern urban communities has been similar to that of foreign-born immigrants. The Irish, the Jews, the Poles, the Greeks, the Italians, etc. The masses of both come into the city's economic life at the bottom and find their first homes in the slum areas. Both are looked down upon by those who got there first. That's a repeated pattern we see throughout many areas in life. The freshmen in high school get looked down on when they first start. In the military, new people arriving in a unit get hazed. Once they settle in, they turn around and do the same thing to the next group. That's a loop. The same thing happened in the city. The ethnic groups who got there first looked down on the newcomers, and in time, those newcomers did the same thing. As time passes, individual immigrants and their ethnic groups as a whole rise in status. Many of them are assimilated and become socially accepted, meaning they became white Americans. That's what that means. We're cutting through all the layers and peeling back the whole onion. They unbecame whatever their ethnicity was, so they could become the white American archetype. White American ideas and beliefs took root and their actions followed. That's how they assimilated and became socially accepted. People eventually forget the foreign antecedents of successful Americans. In the case of Negroes, however, the process stopped short of complete assimilation. Now, why was that? What made Negroes different? A job ceiling limits them to unskilled and semi-skilled work and condemns them to the relief roles during depressions. Residential segregation results in a black ghetto. The color line preserves social segregation and sets the limits of advancement in politics and other non-economic hierarchies. That's the main piece here. Remember, the author said that all ethnic groups started at the bottom. But the difference was that Negroes couldn't just shape-shift their way into the white identity like the other ethnic groups did. That's what made the colonial system so wickedly brilliant. It's that they figured out how to exploit these obvious color differences and build an entire system around keeping people down based on that. You see? It taught people to hyper focus on color. So they know who to exploit and who not to. That's how even Negroes in the North became limited by the job ceiling and confined to the black ghetto. But few people feel that Negroes should have or will have a permanently fixed status. It wouldn't last forever because nothing ever does. Negroes are expected to complain and to use the ballot, their economic power, and the courts to alter their status if they can, which they had done masterfully. When Negroes demand their rights, Midwest metropolis may resist their claims, but it does not usually do so on the ground that they are getting out of their place. Negro-white relations in Midwest metropolis always involve two contradictory principles of social organization: free competition and fixed status. In industry, politics, and the use of public services, the principle of free competition is dominant, but is checked and limited by the principle of fixed status. In the realm of housing, on the other hand, the principle of fixed status predominates but is challenged by the principle of free competition. In social affairs, the principle of fixed status operates almost unchecked. At the present time, Negroes on a mass scale are concerned with establishing the principle of free competition throughout the economic and political life of the city and in the realm of competition for housing. They wanted freedom to move around and do as they please, just like the rest of the American citizens. They absolutely refuse to accept the principle of fixed status in these areas. Unlike the South, Midwest metropolis does not attempt to cow Negroes when they raise such demands. A tradition of Native American white supremacy is absent. The expediencies of city life, the characteristic mobility and anonymity, the wide range of relationships which are interpreted as impersonal, the complex division of labor, all present a favorable setting for the operation of the principle of free competition. The principle of fixed status is alien to urban life as well as to American idealism. So the story America told itself was that people are supposed to have the opportunity for upward mobility. Race conflict in northern urban areas arises when competition is particularly keen for jobs, houses, political power, or prestige, and when Negroes are regarded, with or without foundation, as a threat to those who already have these things or who are competing for them. The typical form of Negro-white conflict in the North is the riot, in the South, lynching. We've got a few more pieces to cover on this book before we wrap it up, so stay tuned. All right, I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.